right, so what I want to talk to you today about is something that I think is going to be very useful. Ask yourself a question. If 80% of Americans identify as Christians or Jewish people, why are Christians and Jewish people seemingly losing every policy debate in this country? You think about the values of Christianity, the values of Judeo-Christianity. Again, 8 out of 10 Americans identify as one of these two religions, and yet it seems culturally, on every single vote, Jewish and Christian values are being subverted. If we have such a majority, why are we losing? And I'm going to explain why. And I'm going to explain what you can do to fix it. The purpose of my talk is to give you a way of understanding argument. The reason we're losing is because the people who are most excited about ideas in our culture don't believe in God. They don't believe in truth anymore. Let me ask you a question, simple question. Can anybody throw out a definition for me? How would you define an intellectual? It's kind of one a big word. Yes, sir. So what? So I kind of like that. Somebody who thinks he knows better. How would you define it, sir?
I'm going to give you the same answer that our Prime Minister Baldwin gave. He said the difference between an intellectual and a man of intellect is the same as that between a gent and a gentleman.
And what I love about both your definitions, and I really like this about both your definitions, it's one of those highfalutin words, right? When we think of an intellectual, we think of somebody usually maybe at a university, but that's not true. In the best possible sense, an intellectual is somebody who gets so excited about ideas that they are able to convince other people that their ideas are true. In fact, you need no education for that, do you? I mean, there's one definition of intellectual. An intellectual is a stodgy academic, somebody who works in a university, somebody who works in a think tank, somebody perhaps educated beyond their intelligence. But stop and think about this. Let me ask you a historical question now. Can you think of any movement in American history that started with just thousands of people coming together at the same time? Can you think of any event in human history that wasn't first the result of somebody's idea? I'll give you an example. I'll throw an issue out at you and you tell me who comes to mind. The Civil Rights Movement. When you think of the Civil Rights Movement, who do you think of? Martin Luther King, right? Anybody else? How about Jesus Christ, right? All of Martin Luther King's influences came from the Bible. How about Rosa Parks? So in other words, the Civil Rights Movement wasn't just people all of a sudden deciding to come together and change things. Somebody had to have an idea. In fact, I'll challenge you. Can you name any event in human history, any major event in human history, that was just spontaneous people coming together? In fact, I'll throw another one. Yes, you got one? You got one? I'm sorry, what? Tower of Babel? That may be the one time in human history that people just did something, right? Didn't end well. I'll throw out World War II for you. When you think of, was World War II just masses of Germans and Japanese and Americans fighting? Who was behind it? Hitler. Who else? Stalin. Okay, you get it. And when you start to think this way, you all understand that an intellectual can be good or evil, right? The ideas of Hitler were horrible. And yet, how effective was Hitler in getting millions of people to follow that bad idea? Now, think about who Adolf Hitler was. He was a short, relatively odd-looking fellow with no real formal education. The Germans in the 1930s were among the most sophisticated people in the world. They had a sophisticated culture. The science of Germany in the 1930s was world-class. How did so many smart, educated people, much smarter than Adolf Hitler, how did they give up everything and follow him? He what? He talked well. But behind the talk was an idea, right? You can talk pretty about nonsense, right? And no one's going to follow it necessarily. But there's got to be an idea too, doesn't there? Hitler had a lot of ideas, most of them bad. But people followed him. In fact, somebody mentioned Jesus Christ. I would argue that perhaps the most, if the purpose of an intellectual is to convince people that his worldview is true and get people to follow him, you could make a serious argument that the most influential intellectual in the history of the world was Jesus Christ. I mean, think about who Jesus Christ was. He didn't have a formal education. He was born a slave in a slave nation. The Jews had been conquered by the Romans, right? Jesus was not rich. He was not educated. And yet think about 2,000 years after the death of Christ, 80% of Americans, 76 to 80% of Americans, still identified. There are still 2 billion Christians in the world today. That is a remarkable success. Think about the ideas of Hitler. They did not outlast the Nazi Empire, did they? They did not really, in a meaningful way, outlast the 1940s. And yet the ideas of Christ, 2,000 years later, are still among the most influential ideas in the world. That's kind of the point I want to make to you. That the vast majority of people act on somebody else's idea. An actual intellectual, and I've been a university professor for 25 years. Lord Monckton is right. There are no intellectuals in universities. It's the place you'd think you'd find them, right? All of these PhDs congregating together, but they don't anymore. They don't think for themselves. This is the disease of progressivism, right? You have the right feelings. You embrace the right politically correct positions. Somebody else has figured out for you, right, what's good and bad. You don't think anymore. My point to you is, if you want to make a difference, and I think Camp Constitution understands this, if you want to make a difference in the world, you have to figure out what your idea is and make it appealing to other people. You got to get people to follow you. You got to get people to take your idea seriously. Take the whole, and I know you're going to hear a lot about this weekend. We've got 2 gentlemen right here going to talk to you about it. But think about the hysteria over climate change. How many people at my university, how many people do you know who believe it? My university kids, when I ask them, how do you know the climate's changing? Because science said so. They have no evidence. My university kids are all convinced that the world is warming, that the end is near. And when I ask them, can you name a single scientist of climate? You know what they say? Al Gore. Yeah. Right? You know what they say? Bill Nye. Right? The non-science guy. That's an example of how powerful ideas are. How many kids your age have bought the lie of global climate change? But they've bought it because it's being sold in a certain way. Yep. And so my argument to you guys is, if you don't A, understand what it is you believe, and B, if you can't articulate what you believe in such a way that people want to follow your idea, you're going to follow somebody else. And you know the word we have for this? Sheep. Think about sheep for a second. Do you know why bishops in the Old Testament had staffs with hooks on them? Y'all seen those pictures of bishops, right? With the big hook on the end of their staff. That's because sheep are kind of stupid animals. A sheep, if you've got a big, fast-moving body of water, sheep don't know any better. They'll wander into that fast-moving body of water, and then their wool gets so soaked that they get sucked underwater and they drown. Shepherds used to have hooks on their staffs to reach into the water and yank a stupid sheep out. Here's the sad reality. Most people who have ever lived follow ideas they don't understand. And so if we can get you to understand why ideas matter and get you to analyze the ideas that are being thrown at you. Look, the fact that you're here, the fact that your parents brought you here indicates that you have parents who don't want you to be sheep, right? And that is a big deal. How is it, I'll go back to my original question, how is it that 75 to 80% of Americans identify as Jewish or Christian, traditional values, and yet look at the policies, look at the way the world's going. We are a huge majority who seem to lose every cultural battle. It's because the intellectuals in America today, most of them, are atheist, materialist, secular, progressive. The people on your news, the journalists who write your news, liberals. The professors who teach your classes, liberals. The entertainers, kids your age, pay good money to listen to on the radio or go see in concert or go watch their movies. They're all liberal. Think about the Hollywood progressive elite. I have never encountered less educated people more convinced of stupid things that aren't true than you find in Hollywood, right? Anne Hathaway. These people are going to tell you policy issues. How many people? It is a tragic reality for younger children, people under 20. 78% of people under 20 get their news primarily from cable entertainment channels. You know what kind of news they're getting, right? And so what I've done, if you look at your chart, you won't be able to see it much over here. The very first idea you have to get your mind around. Until you decide where you sit on this idea, you're going to be a sheep unless you answer this question. And you know, most people never ever ask themselves this question. Number one, what is the moral nature of man? What are we as moral creatures? There's only, believe it or not, there's only 4 answers to that question. And which one you pick depends on everything. There are only 4 ways to answer the question. What is man's moral nature? Well, let's just start with an obvious one. Human beings are evil, right? That's an argument. That human beings are born evil, they live evil, they die evil. There's nothing you can choose that's not evil. As a matter of fact, if you look at your chart, at the top of the chart, relative dominance of moral views of man among intellectuals in Western culture. So you get my point. If I'm right, and I've not heard a single argument against it, it's intellectuals who decide what the world's going to be, not you and me. Most of us will sheep-like follow. So if you want to know how culture's going to be in 100 years, or 50 years, or 10 years, consider what the intellectuals are saying. Number 2, there's only 4 real ways that you can claim about human moral behavior. I started with, on your chart, the one called philosophical Calvinism and Hobbesism. If you look on the left side of your sheet, the box going up and down. Any of you ever watched read the cartoon Calvin and Hobbes? Right? All right. Calvin and Hobbes is about a little boy and his tiger. And if you know anything about Calvin and Hobbes, they're always getting into trouble, right? The ideas of Calvin and Hobbes are to just wreak mayhem everywhere. The author of that comic strip, Bill Waterston, he named them Calvin and Hobbes for a reason. The 2 intellectuals in human history who most believed that human beings were evil by nature were John Calvin, a 16th century theologian, and Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century atheist philosopher. Thomas Hobbes, you may recall, made the argument that all human life is short, brutish, nasty, and ugly. That by nature, the atheist argued, human life is, we're nothing but animals. Our morality is the morality of animals. John Calvin, the religious reformer in the 16th century, he's the guy who came up with the idea that human nature is evil. We're going to live our lives as bad people. No matter what we do, can't get away from evil. And when we die, we are all going to go to hell. Except that God's a nice guy, and God may rescue a couple 100,000 of us. Right? Now, do you understand? If you look at your chart, even in the 16th and 17th centuries, do you see that that was never a dark line? Most intellectuals never believed that. And you know why? What mother wants to look down at her newborn baby? Yeah. Right? Oh, such an evil baby. Oh, you're such a nasty... It's not. It's anti-human nature, right? So nobody, no serious intellectuals in the history of the world ever believed in Calvin and Hobbes' worldview.
How honest you are, right? But we still think about it. We still talk about it. It's just
we do talk about it, right? And we do talk about it, yes.
The lines on the chart where the
So the dark lines, the lines on the chart suggest that the darker the line, the more intellectuals believed that during that time. And look at the chart. It goes all the way back to Egyptian and Hebrew civilization, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, all the way through the 20th century. And so if you look at the line, even the Calvin and Hobbes line, notice how it's not even a dark line. Some people in the 16th and 17th century believed it, like Calvin and Hobbes, but the vast majority of people in the 16th and 17th centuries didn't believe it. And by the way, this is true of all cultures, not just Western culture. So the idea that human beings are intrinsically evil, they're unredeemable, their every thought and impulse is wicked, no one seriously believed that, even during the time of Calvin and Hobbes. But take the opposite of that premise. I call it philosophical romanticism. And that makes sense, right? It provides a very romantic view of human nature. Think about the English romantic poets, right? Rambling on about the child being the father of the man, right? That the younger you are, the more morally superior you are. Tell me you don't live in that culture now. And by the way, look where philosophical romanticism began. In the middle of the 18th century. It arose with the Enlightenment. Philosophical romanticism is the view that underpins modern socialism, modern communism, and modern progressivism. It is the argument that all people are perfectly good and rational. That if you simply explain something logical to a person, they'll do it. But how many, raise your hand if you put too much salt on your French fries. Of course you do, I do too. You're all raising your hands. Raise your hands if you don't always eat what's good for you. Of course you, everybody. Well, look at me. I am the walking, talking definition of that. In other words, reason is not primarily what human beings want. And by the way, if you lived in a perfectly rational society, what would happen to love? See, love's not rational, is it? How many books written in the 20th century were written by people, including left-wing people, who recognized the dangers of reason alone? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1984, Brave New World, right? Over and over again, Animal Farm, the great books of Western culture in the last 100 years, warn you about this worldview. Remember who George Orwell was? George Orwell was a Fabian socialist who came to recognize that this worldview was destroying people. That is one of the dominant two worldviews in the world today. In other words, the majority of world intellectuals today believe it. They believe that people are intrinsically good. Now think about that with the way we raise our kids. If you believe that people are intrinsically good, they're born good, their every thought and impulse is good, then do you need education? Well, think about it. If you're born good, can education make you gooder? And here's a question I ask my leftist friends. If people are born good, why does evil exist in the world?
Yeah.
And you know what their answer is, right?
Leftovers.
Not leftovers. Their answer is, people are good, but institutions are bad. Is that not the socialist mantra? People are good, das Kamrad. You and me good, comrade, right? It's the church that's bad. It's the corporation that's bad, right? In my bad Russian accent. Think about it. If corporations are nothing but people, how can they be bad? If we're all good as individuals, how suddenly when we get together in groups do we become bad? It's the inherent contradiction of socialism. And by the way, that's why socialists the world over, when they present you with their logical reason why you should be like everybody else, when socialists and communists and Marxists and progressives present you with their argument why you should give up your individuality, you should give up your liberty, you should give up your freedom, your guns, and your religion to follow their worldview, and you don't, because guess what? Reason isn't enough for you. That's why they put bullets in your heads. Do you understand this with socialism? The minute you do the irrational thing, the minute you don't do what they rationally say you should do, they kill you. Ronald Reagan once said, why is it that Soviet communist states need guns to keep their people in, and we in the free West need guns to keep them out?
That's right.
Right? That's the problem. When you start with the premise that people are intrinsically good, and yet they do bad things, you know you shouldn't eat that. You know you shouldn't do that, and yet you do it anyway. Free will. And in a socialist state, if you start from the premise that people are inherently good, you have no way of dealing with reality. That's why socialism is so divorced from reality. The economics don't work. So what? It just hasn't been tried correctly, right? But sir, we have no serious evidence, going all the way back to 1998, that the world's warming. Doesn't matter. Don't let it get in the way of the socialist narrative, right? The natural goodness of man. Philosophical romanticism. You want to know why? Over the last couple hundred years, the world has careened. Notice this too. Until you came up with philosophical romanticism, you could not have had socialism or Marxism or fascism. What was the Nazis' credo? We are going to engineer the perfect man. We're going to remove imperfect people, right? People we deem to have the wrong blood or the wrong skin color or the wrong political affiliations. That's what you do. If people are inherently good, you just have to clear away everything that gets in the way of their goodness, which turns out to be pretty much everything, right? And by the way, take a look. So, philosophical romanticism, born in the Enlightenment. Philosophical naturalism, also what most modern intellectuals believe. And what is it? It's the argument, the scientific argument, that there's no such thing as morality. You're just highly evolved animals, like other animals, right? Dogs don't have morality. Wolves and foxes, they don't. They're instinctive creatures, right? Animals in the wild kill primarily. You're either killing or you're being. What happens to sheep in the wilderness? They get killed by wolves. If the philosophical naturalists are right, there is no such thing as morality. It's simply a social construct. You're just animals. If that's true, then you have two choices. You're either going to be a sheep or a wolf, right? You're either going to be a predator or a prey. Raise your hand if you want to be a sheep. If those are your only two choices, those are your only two choices. Raise your hand if you want to be a wolf. Well, look at you. Think about that for a moment. That's what the philosophical naturalists are telling you. You are merely biological creatures. Therefore, the natural order of things is for the stronger to dominate the weaker, right? Why do you choose wolf over sheep? Because sheep get eaten by wolves. But who was it that made himself the Lamb of God? Who did that? What does that mean, Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God? Let's just step back for a second. If Jesus Christ is who he says he is, then it's fair to say he was the most powerful creature to ever walk this earth. Is that fair to say? If Jesus Christ is the Son of God incarnate, if Jesus Christ is the walking embodiment of the Creator God in human form, then there was no creature ever stronger to walk this earth. And yet, what did the strongest choose? He didn't choose to be a wolf. What did he choose?
A lamb.
He chose to be a lamb. You see, in the philosophical naturalist world, why is Christianity under assault? Much more than any other religion in this country. Why is it that progressive leftists in this country have much more sympathy for radical Islam than they do for Orthodox Christianity and Judaism? Well, think about the way Orthodox Islam manifests itself in many parts of the world. Like wolves, right? We can't live alongside you. You either have to become our slaves or we kill you. You either accept our worldview or we're going to have to take you out, right? You think about that, why does the progressive left sympathize with radical Islam? Because it's totalitarian, right? It's the same worldview, that we have the right and the necessity to dominate you. And you see what unholy alliances are bred simply on the basis of what you believe. Think about the entire progressive left. Their two primary worldviews are the natural goodness of man and the fact that there's no such thing as goodness. That, by the way, justifies, you think about Hitler. People want to argue Hitler and the Nazis were some right-wing organization. Just keeping my eye on the time here. Were some right-wing organizations. That can't possibly be true. In the 1930s, when Hitler took power, do you know what 3 of the first 4 things he did were? Gun control. He confiscated everybody's guns. national health care. He socialized medicine. And number 3, absolutely no homeschooling. No schooling except government schools. Do those strike you as right-wing initiatives? And most people don't realize the word Nazi stands for National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis were socialists. They weren't right-wingers. Nothing they did could be considered right-wing. And yet, the Bolsheviks, the communists, the progressives, the Nazis, they all you would have to. They believe deeply in these two worldviews. There were certain perfectible aspects of human nature. For the Nazis, it was the Aryan race, right? For the Soviet communists, it was the proletariat. And the irony here is that when you stop and think about the logical conclusion of those two worldviews, it ends in death. It has to. Anybody who doesn't get on board with your rational program has to be eliminated. There can be no individual thought. There is no individuality. There is only the collective. And by the way, if we are all just animals, which animals are the most successful? The ones who hunt in packs. Right? The ones who hunt in packs. Man, by that argument, if all we are is animals, then man is the most successful animal in human history. We've learned how to hunt collectively, right? But do you understand that this is the death of the individual? At every turn, this is the death of the individual. And again, if you look at the chart, it explains not just the last 250 years of Western culture, but it also explains the last 10 years in the West as well. Our entire moral premise is relativism. Notice, one example I'll give you is gender. I teach at universities. You go to a modern university, and I'm not going to call them intellectuals, the professors there will tell you that male and female are a made-up social construct. Forget biology. There is no such thing as male and female. And yet, those same professors will also tell you that 92 different made-up genders between male and female are absolutely true. And if you don't follow them, you'll be suspended. How about the kid in the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, a couple states over, right? This kid was a biology major. And this biology major was sitting in his biology class with his biology textbook, and his biology professor was telling him that there is no such thing as male and female. Kid raised his hand and said, "But ma'am, my biology textbook, the textbook you made us buy for class, only discusses male and female because there is nothing else in biology. There is nothing else in biology but male and female. It's the only scientific gender underpinning we have." All right? Science says. Who's the anti-science party? These professors stand up and they say, in biology class, there is no male and female. But 86, 92 different amalgams in male and female, that's what you... So this kid raised his hand, and he said, I'm a biology student. The biology textbook says there's man and female. You know what she did? She told him to stop speaking immediately. She had him suspended from the class. She had him removed from his dorm. And the university was this close to expelling him for simply asserting what science says. And had it not been for a huge national outrage, he would have been expelled. He was ultimately allowed back into his class. No apology. No consequences for the biology professor who did this to him. That's what's happening on your universities. The ideology of the left now trumps biological science. And so we have a moral obligation to combat that. And that leaves one thing. Notice, before we move to the last one, that each of these three worldviews, Calvin and Hobbesism, which nobody really ever took seriously, but these two, Naturalism and Romanticism, do you know what they all have in common? All three of them get rid of free will. See, if you're born evil, said Calvin, there's nothing you can choose that will save you. There's nothing you can choose that will warrant your salvation. Now, God might save you. Not because of your merit, but because of his choice. There's nothing redeemable of human nature. If that's true, then why would you try to be better? I mean, if you're evil to begin with, if evil is who you are, what is the purpose of trying not to be? Same thing goes with philosophical naturalism. If you're just an animal, and there is no such thing as morality, then shouldn't you try to be an alpha predator rather than a sheep? Is that not simply the history of Nazism and fascism and communism and Bolshevism? What is it? Why is it that the first rule for all Soviet Marxists, all communists, all socialists, is there is no God? See, if there is no God, then there is no higher moral being that makes sure morality means something. There's also no choice. You get rid of the idea of God, you get rid of the idea of choice, right? And there's nothing to choose. And so for the philosophical naturalist, you can make up rules and laws, you can make up codes of conduct, but they're all just arbitrary, aren't they? We believe one thing in the West, Chinese people believe another thing, the South Americans have a different cultural attitude, in India they have different norms, so therefore it's all just relative, right? If you are just animals, then you're not. I'm old enough to remember, 25 years ago, for thousands of years, we used to compare human bad behavior to animal behavior. You know what? We're not animals. Don't be as greedy as a fox or as, right? Don't be as gluttonous as a pig. All the bad things we used to do. We used to say, well, look at the animals. My golden retriever, if I leave the house with a bag of dog food open, my golden retriever is going to eat the whole bag, and then he's going to throw up, and he's going to eat the throw up back. He will eat as much as I let him, because he's a dog, right? You don't think about these things. He'll make himself sick. If all we are animals, notice how now the argument for human behavior is pointing to animals and saying we should do this too. Environmentalists are trying to give human rights not just to animals, but to rivers and mountains and streams. Right? Because, there's no real difference between us and any other kind of animal. The lunatics at PETA, right? The people for the so-called ethical treatment of animals, are now basically saying that if you eat a hamburger, you are participating in the Holocaust. Right? Notice what happens as we begin to move intellectually this way. Gender itself, right? There is no such thing as biology. There is no such thing as scientifically underwritten sex. There's just your choice, right? There's just your abstract choice, which becomes subsumed by bigger ones. And the same thing is true of philosophical romanticism. If you're already, why are we raising kids without boundaries? Why are we raising kids? My goodness, you spank a kid today, they'll throw you in jail. The idea that you have any boundaries whatsoever for kids is now considered wicked, right? And that's because of philosophical romanticism. If human beings are intrinsically good, the younger you are, the better you are, right? With every year you get older, you get more corrupted by society. This is Wordsworth's point, right? The younger you are, the more perfect you are. Tell me we don't have a culture geared exclusively for little children, for kids, right? To be 25 years old and an actress is almost to be too old, right? Whereas the wise cultures of the Orient revered the elderly, right? It was the seniors who were in charge because they had the wisdom, they had lived it, right? In the West now, we have deified the young, the child, right? And so all three of these worldviews, Calvin and Hobbesism and the two that dominate today, Romanticism and Naturalism, they allow no room really for free choice. No really free choice. And any meaningful morality, any meaningful sense of truth, any meaningful idea that makes sacrifice possible. Again, remember Christ, the strongest creature who ever lived, who chose to sacrifice himself for others. The shepherd. How often in the Gospels does Christ refer to himself as the good shepherd? And what does a shepherd do? He interposes himself between the sheep and the wolf, right? That's the best of all human societies. The willingness of the strong to look after the weak. Can you imagine what an evolutionary biologist would say? Wait, you're telling me that I'm an alpha predator and I have to give my life for the sheep? That makes no logical sense. But you know what it does? It makes radical moral sense, doesn't it? And that's philosophical classicism. And every society in the history of the world, from about 1800 all the way back, I don't care who you name, I don't care what part of the world you name them, every single human society, in its own way, believed that human beings had some basic moral choice to make. That we cannot just follow our instincts. That we have to choose better over worse, righter over wronger, truer over falser. And if you think again about Christianity, forget about Christianity as religion for a moment. Focus on Christianity as an idea. There has never been an idea in the history of the world more committed to the individual than that one. Think about Christ. If I were, I'm a weak man, like all men are. If I were Jesus Christ, I would not have touched all those sick people. Can you imagine? In the hot desert sun, all those lepers and sick people. When Jesus healed them, you know what I'd have done? I'd have gotten all the sick people together on the beach. And I'd have climbed up on a rock, and I would have dream of genied them. I'd have boinked them into health, right? I would have just healed them from afar. But when you read the Gospels, how did Jesus do it? He got on his knees and spit in the dirt and made mud of the spit and put them on the blind man's eyes. He put his fingers in the deaf man's ear and jiggled them around. Put his hands on people. I mean, the Gospels tell us again and again and again how this wolf, right, this creator wolf, walked among the sheep and tended them with his own hands. Even if you don't believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, there is still no example in human history quite like that one, about the need for the strong to consciously and willingly sacrifice for the weak. And those are some of the axes of Western culture. Now again, have we screwed it up? Yep. Have we fallen down? Absolutely. But the idea endures. Philosophical classicism. It's not just a Christian idea, but it's a remarkable idea, and it's the only idea on our list here that gives you any meaningful freedom. You have urges, you have impulses, we all do. The modern progressive world says those impulses are who you are. You should act on them. You know, the American Psychiatric Association has just made road rage a disorder. You know that? According to the American Psychiatric Association, you're perfectly calm and normal, healthy, in your right mind, driving your car, somebody cuts you off, and you get so angry that you run them off the road, you pull out a gun and you shoot them. Now that's not a bad choice you made now, that's a sickness. According to the American Psychological Society, you were for 10 minutes sick. See, once you label somebody sick, you can't hold them accountable anymore, right? Do you know how many things the modern left has labeled disease? You know what my favorite is? This is certifiably true. It's called CDD. You know what it stands for? Childhood Disobedience Disorder. Wow. So every time you ignore your parents, every time you do the wrong thing, it's not your fault. Right? You have a trauma. And by the way, how are we treating little kids now when they do bad things? We medicate them. We invent things like ADHD, right? 2 million American boys between the ages of 8 and 15, 2 million American boys are on Ritalin or some variant. And you know, these same people are even making Prozac now for dogs. So think about this. You come home from a hard day's work. Fido's been chained up in the basement. What is the first thing Fido does after being left alone for 8 hours when you show up?
Poop on the couch.
Poop on the couch, right? He's all dancing around, wagging his tail, and that's just too much. After a hard day's work, we don't want to come home and walk the dog or throw the tennis ball. So what do now? You give Fido doggy Prozac, so he lays by his water bowl and drools. In the progressive naturalistic world, you don't deal with people, you medicate them. You dull them, right? Or cannabis is another one, right? This frenzy of the legalization of marijuana now. Oh, I have a friend in Colorado. You know what just surpassed alcohol-related driving incidents in Colorado? Pot-induced driving, right? The same leftists who want alcohol banned because drunk drivers are radically behind the immediate access of cannabis and pot if anybody wants it. And notice what they do. As soon as pot's legalized, they start engineering it. So it has a much, much bigger punch, right? Now they're engineering strains of marijuana that kill you. You think about how all this fits in a paradigm. And you go back and you think about philosophical classicism. It's kind of common sense, isn't it? My few minutes left. First of all, raise your hand. Philosophical classicism is simply the idea that every human being has in their own heart the capacity for good and bad, right and wrong, good and evil. Raise your hand if you've ever met anybody perfectly evil. Anybody? As bad as Hitler was, he was a vegetarian. Did you know that? According to the left, that's morally good, right?
That makes it perfect.
Makes it perfectly good, right? Hitler loved his mother. Hitler loved animals. Flip it around. Have you ever met anybody perfectly good? Would any of you say you've ever met anybody perfectly good? Nobody? Yes?
My lovely wife.
Your lovely wife. Let me ask you a question, sir. If I asked, is she here? Is your lovely wife here?
No, she's
Oh, okay. If I asked your lovely wife if she was perfectly good, what would she say?
She would be honest
And?
say that she didn't think she was perfectly good, but that's simply because she is perfectly good.
Here's what I would say. If I asked the good sir's wife, if I asked his wife if she was perfectly good, you're right. She would say no. Now that means one of two things.
That means she's perfectly good.
Well, or it means she knows she's not, or she's lying.
Right.
It means she's being socially conventional.
Well, hey, I would argue.
It means she's being socially conventional in not boasting about how good she is.
Right. But I would argue if you defer to social convention at the expense of the truth, you're probably not perfectly good. In other words, I'm willing to concede, sir, that your wife is the best wife of all wives, but no wife is perfect.
Except mine.
You'd think she would. He's a smart guy. He knows this is being filmed and she may see it. Call it cynical. But as I wind down here, the bottom line is, generally speaking, you realize, right? You don't need a PhD. We talked about intellectuals. You don't need a PhD. You don't need 25 years of college to recognize, right, that all of us have made good choices and bad choices. Yes. That all of us are capable of better choices and worse choices. And if that's true, then guess what? Education matters, doesn't it? See, education doesn't matter if you're evil always. It doesn't matter if you're good always. It doesn't matter really if you're an animal. An educated animal is still an animal. I might train my dog to be a good dog, but if I leave and he eats all the food and throws up, I can't take him to court over it. I can't spank my golden retriever, right? He's not going to learn that. You can't take the dog completely out of the dog. However, if philosophical classicism is true, then the possibility of God is true.
That's right.
In fact, God is necessary. If philosophical classicism is true, if our nature as human beings is that we do have moral choice, then there is nothing in nature that explains that choice. Not in reason, not in biology, not in physics or chemistry. There has to be something more. And that's why it's a compelling argument that for the first 5,000 years of human culture, everybody recognized the basic choice ability. Everybody had commandments and laws and rules that govern behavior. And you have the right to choose or not choose. If we take away the right to choose, if we de-emphasize human individuality, if we lower human beings to the levels of animals, then you get what you're getting now. Intellectual, moral chaos, right? Where you are what you say you are, no matter what you say you are. Right? Whatever you feel like today is what you are, and the whole world has to treat you that way. I'm 12 years old, I'm male, but I think I'm a girl, which means I get to shower with the girls now, and if the girls don't like it, the girls are bigots. That is nonsense. Moral, intellectual, and ethical nonsense. And yet that's where your culture's heading. But at least understand why it's heading there. If nothing else, try to, when you argue with people on the other side, you point out the fundamental nature, right? We are not animals. Because most leftists would say, no, of course we're not just animals. Well, but your whole worldview makes us animals. Of course we have free will, most leftists would say. At which point then you ask them where it came from. And if there is free will, doesn't that negate these two worldviews? But it's a rubric. It's a way to begin to talk to people on the other side about what the reality is. And if you see it for yourself, right? If you've never met anybody completely good, you never met anybody completely evil, you know in your own heart that you have consciously chosen better over worse. I ask this all the time. Anybody smoke in here? My last comment. Anybody or used to smoke? All right, somebody. May I ask you, when you started smoking, how old were you when you started smoking? 16? When you were 16 and took your first cigarette, did you know cigarettes were bad for you? You did. Right, exactly. The idea that Joe Camel made you smoke is ridiculous. When you took your first puff, you knew they were bad for you. So you made a choice. Now to turn around then and blame cigarette companies for your addiction is kind of silly, given that when you took you snuck one of Dad's beers out of the refrigerator, went behind the garage and had your first sip, you know you were doing something you shouldn't do. No, it's not as if you thought beer was Kool-Aid. You knew. You always know, right? So keep that in mind. And I can, if anybody would like a handout who didn't get one, I'll email you one. So if you want this hard copy of this in your email, come up and get a business card, and I will make sure I mail it to you. But you guys have been a great audience. Thanks for listening today.
Yay.